The challenging times faced by business these days have shown the difficulty in managing HR issues and maintaining profitability. Keeping focus on the core business and finding the right partners to help with ancillary functions like HR administration is why more than 500 companies across the country turn to Tryon Solutions. Tryon relieves the stress and burden of HR administration so companies, small to large, can stay focused on why they went into business in the first place. Small companies turn to Tryon to manage their payroll and taxes, benefits administration, workers' compensation, and regulatory compliance, so they don't need to build a big HR department. Larger companies add Tryon as an extension of their existing HR staffs, achieving efficiencies and enhancing the bottom line. Check out Tryon at RelyOnTryon.com and receive a free consultation from one of its business advisors. It'll be the best business decision you'll ever make.
Welcome, Campus Heroes, to Reboot the World Campus Party's first ever digital edition. It's the last session of the U.S. stage today, and we're excited to have Alon Yaffee from Barracuda Networks presenting his topic, The Most Focused You in the New Normal. Over to you, Alon.
All right, thanks, Carol. So I'm going to start with a quick introduction about myself, what I do, and then go straight to it, and hopefully not keep you guys too long. So I worked in the software industry basically all of my adult life. Started early in computers and made a career out of it. I was a software developer initially, but for the last 20 years or so, I worked mostly in product management. My current job is VP of Product Management for Data Security at Barracuda Networks. And for those of you who don't know, Barracuda makes security products for email, data, networks, and applications. This presentation is going to be about focus, or creating focus, which I think is especially important now that many of us are working remotely, and it's kind of hard to get together with a bunch of people and really discuss things. And when we are thinking about creating focus, I think the main thing we need to think about are priorities. So what I would like to do is take you through a discussion about how we take a concept like priorities, which could be pretty complicated, and make it as easy as pie. And as you will see in a minute, I mean that pretty literally. So the concepts I'm going to talk about apply mostly to software development. That's my background. But I think that you will find that they can apply to pretty much any kind of project or thing you're working on, as well as potentially some tasks in your personal life. So we're going to start with looking at a typical priority scale that, if you have ever worked in any software organization, no matter how big or small, you've probably encountered before. And the main question we're trying to answer with a priority scale is really how important and or urgent a certain thing is. And most of these priority scales look something like this, where you have the letter P, that stands for priority, and then a number. And actually, the smaller the number is, the more important the thing is. So something like a P4 usually represents something that might be important, but is probably not urgent. And in many cases, people will tell you P4s are probably not important and will never get done. Then you have P3s, which are things that are probably important, but maybe also not that urgent. P2s are things that are starting to get important. They are probably urgent. P1s are very important and urgent, and P0s are the kind of thing we're just going to stop everything and just do it right now. So this is not that complicated. The complexity usually comes from really understanding how different things you're working on, especially problems like bugs in your software, fit into any of these categories. So the bad news, priorities are hard. The good news is that pies are not hard. Everybody loves pies. And I think that pies can be incredibly helpful when you're trying to think of priorities. So what I like to do is, instead of, if you remember those P4s through P0s, instead of having P stand for priority, I like to think of P as standing for pie-ority. And the process of converting a priority to a pie-ority is actually pretty simple, and it involves 3 fairly easy steps. Step 1, we think of a task or a problem or a situation that we have that we need to deal with. Step 2, we visualize that situation as a pie. And then step 3, we ask ourselves, how bad is it really? Like, is that something we would really like to eat, or do we need to fix? And I know you're probably thinking, okay, but that doesn't sound actually that easy. So let me give you some examples. I spent a lot of time in the last few years working on backup products. So backup products usually allow you to take files, create copies, move them somewhere else, and allow you to restore those files if you need to, like if they were deleted or corrupted or whatever. So I'll use some examples from that space. But again, I think these examples will apply to many, many other things. So let's say I have a fairly simple backup product. My customer, my user, can log in to a web interface through a browser, and they can browse files on their computer, and they can decide which of them they want to copy and back up and what they want to restore. Now, I log into that product, and I use a browser that I've never used before. Normally I use Chrome, but maybe I decided to use Safari or Edge, or maybe I'm super adventurous and I use Firefox. So suddenly I see that the fonts are not right, or things are not in the right place, and the user interface for the product starts to look a little bit janky. So let's visualize that as a pie. It might look something like this. So this is actually, looks like a cherry pie. Actually, it looks pretty good, like it's well baked. But if you look at it, it's not perfect, right? Like there's all of these slits are not in the right place, and crust is kind of falling apart. So it's not perfect. But at the same time, it is still a very well-baked pie, and it is still delicious. So when I think about what a P4 represents, it is really something that is imperfect, but also delicious. All right, let's move on to example number 2. Now I log into this backup product, and I try to select a file to restore, to bring back to my computer. And I get one of those super helpful error messages that say something like, something went wrong, try again. So I try again, and it works, and my file is restored. So actually, things are pretty good. So if I try to visualize that kind of problem as a pie, it probably looks like this. It's, again, still an okay looking pie. Again, still baked, very much edible. There's a piece that fell off. So it's more than not perfect. There's actually something here that's actually broken, but it is still okay to eat. It's still tasty. So my P3s are usually things that are slightly broken, but still tasty. Example number 3. So I have a folder with 50 photos on my computer, and I want to back it up. I log into my backup application, and I select the folder to back up, and I get an error message, and it doesn't work. But then I try to select each file individually and back it up, and that actually does work. So this is a situation where if I visualize it as a pie, it would probably look like this. It's not great. It's definitely not looking very appetizing. It's burned. It didn't rise well in the oven. It is what I would call edible with compromises. And those compromises can be actually pretty serious. So if I really, really, really have to eat that pie, I probably can, but ideally I wouldn't want to. That would be a P2. My next example would be a little bit more serious. So let's say my son played with my computer and deleted all of these photos, and now I want to restore them. They're really, really important to me. So I go into my backup application because I created a backup, and I try to restore these files, and it doesn't work. I get some error messages. Things don't work at all. I try again, and it still doesn't work. So I call tech support, and tech support does some magic behind the scenes, and they're able to restore my files. So I solved the problem, but the way to get there was really, really not good. The product really did not work. So if I try to visualize that as a pie, it's starting to look pretty disgusting. Like, this is something that's on the floor, the cat has got to it, there are flies all over the place. Definitely not something I would want to serve to a lot of people. That would be, I would define that as a P1. It's something that is still preferable to starving, but definitely not something I would want to eat on a normal basis. So that would be a P1. So let's look at another example. And at this point, you should be asking yourself, can things really get any worse than what I just showed you? And the answer is, yes, they can. Let's say I try to access my backup product and I get nothing, absolutely nothing. Nothing works. At that point, we have no pie. And usually that is what I would characterize as a P0 problem. This is a situation where you should really not evaluate whether it's worth fixing, when it's worth fixing. You have to jump on it and you have to address it right now. So going back to the priority scale that I showed you in the beginning, and now let's think about it again in terms of pies, then the pie-ority scale really asks, how bad is this pie? And here things look a little bit different. The P4 becomes something that's imperfect yet delicious. P3 is slightly broken, but still tasty. P2 is edible with compromises. P1 is preferable to starving, and P0 is no pie. There's absolutely nothing there. All right, so the interesting things about priorities is that they do depend on circumstances. Like everything that I just talked about, you make those evaluations for yourself, maybe you discuss it with a few people, but you can't actually consider all of these things in a vacuum. There are circumstances that will and should influence how you prioritize problems or tasks for your product or your project. And some of these things, especially now that we're talking about pies, some of these questions look like, how many people are waiting for pie? So if you have something that maybe is not very delicious, but there's a lot of people you need to serve it to that are going to be impacted by the quality of that pie, then the priority of fixing it or replacing it should probably be higher. It's also important to understand how long can the people wait, because sometimes you know how you can address the problem, but it will take you a long time. You have a lot of people that really need pie right now, so that should escalate your priority as well. And then the other question I would always ask is if there are acceptable alternatives. So if the pie is disgusting, can there be something else that the customer can use while I go and bake a new pie? So we're going to put it all together, and now this is what I call the modified pie-ority scale. Is not just how bad or good is the pie, but how bad is it given the circumstances. And you can see that things like if there's a lot of important people or lots of people or picky eaters, those are the kind of things that will take maybe a problem that's not so terrible and make it a little bit more serious. And, you know, exactly on the other hand, if there are few people, they're very patient, they hate pie anyway, then maybe even if my pie is super disgusting, it's not that big of a deal. So to summarize, to get to a simple pie-ority instead of a complicated priority, the steps are pretty simple. You think of a task or a problem, you make it look like a pie, you think about how bad is it, and then you think about how bad is it considering the circumstances? And once you're able to answer all of these questions, you should be able to come with a fairly straightforward prioritization for the thing you're working on that should be pretty easy to get a lot of people to agree on. And that is really important, because when you want to get something done, you want to make sure that everybody has a shared understanding of the priority. So this is my main framework for prioritizing software bugs or problems or issues that arise during a project. But what's nice about pies is that you can also use pies to build new things. So we talked about problems, but we can also use pies to decide what new things we want to add to a product or what we want to build, especially when we have limited resources, which everybody does. So here I would like to introduce you to what I call the daunting stargazing principle. It sounds very, very complicated, but I assure you that it is not. So let's start with this picture. I don't know if you've seen this before, but this is a tart tatin. It is amazing. It is something that, at least according to the stories or legends, was created by complete accident by a hotel cook in France that either baked an apple pie but forgot to bake a crust first and then ended up pouring the crust on top, or just burned the filling and needed to cover for that. So this is basically a pie that was baked upside down as an apple pie, but then served flipped so that it looked like a pie. What's interesting about this, whether, let's assume that the story is true and this was really created by accident, it is delicious. It has stood the test of time, and it is a thing. Like, you can look at a cookbook or search for tart tatin on the internet, and you will find a lot of recipes, and many of them are going to be amazing. And then I want you to contrast that with this thing that you see on the screen right now, which is called the stargazing pie. The stargazing pie was created in Cornwall, England, to celebrate a local fisherman. And you can see the fish heads are actually pointing up, so they are stargazing, hence stargazing pie. I am sure that some people probably love this thing, and I am also convinced that it will never, ever become a thing. So the daunting stargazing principle is that you can accidentally create something that everybody wants, and on the flip side, you can deliberately create something that nobody wants. And, I can't really tell you how to accidentally create something, because that's an accident. But what I would like to focus on is how we avoid the situation that we deliberately create something that nobody wants. And this is where I think we can look at some indicators. So when you're thinking about a new feature you're building into your product, or something new in your project, or a new task you want to take on, I think it's important to pay attention to some stargaziness indicators that you might identify. The first one is you want to see whether it will satisfy a niche, or if it's something that has broad applicability. And this is something that we see in product development all the time. So a large customer will come in and will say, I need your product to do this particular feature, and they might be the only customer that will ever use that feature. So if you see something that's a niche, that could indicate stargaziness. That is not a good thing. The second thing you want to look at is whether it actually supports your long-term goals, because especially when we're dealing with limited resources, and I know especially now during the pandemic, many companies are actually forced to do more with less and are actually cutting resources. So it's really, really important to pick things that are really compatible with your long-term goals. So if I'm in the market for building a super easy-to-use backup product, and somebody has asked me for something that will make the product very, very complicated, then obviously that is not compatible with the long-term goals. And then the last thing you want to think of is whether building the thing that you're being asked to build will negatively impact other priorities and other requests that you have. And that is actually almost always true. So every time you pick something and you prioritize it ahead of something else. But I think if you consider these three things, like if you're asked to do something and you think it's a niche request that's not necessarily compatible with what you're trying to do at a high level, and to add to that has a negative impact on everything else that you're doing, to me, that indicates stargaziness, and that is something you absolutely want to avoid. And I will leave you with the thought that remember that pies, at the end of the day, make everything better, especially if they can help us take fairly complicated concepts and make them simple. Thank you. Let's see if we have any questions.
So we have one question that came in. Have you ever used that framework in your workplace?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. In fact, we've developed it in my workplace. There was one particular project a few years ago that I worked on with somebody else in the organization, and the biggest problem we had was actually to try to align different people in our engineering organization on a common definition of priorities. And we tried over and over and over again to explain to people why something was a P2 versus a P3. And there were all of these parameters we were looking at. And so I sat down with another guy, one of our UX designers on the team, and we thought, okay, how can we really simplify this thing? And we came up with the pie-ority scale, where we basically decided, instead of trying to explain to people why something is important or not important, is really just have them try to visualize it in the form of a pie. And the more disgusting the thing is, probably the higher priority the thing is.
Great. I just want to thank you for your time, Alon, and also a special thanks to all our sponsors. And we will definitely see you all tomorrow on day 2 of Reboot the World Campus Parties, first ever digital edition. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.